As the 80s dawned, some of the network was starting to look a bit old, maybe even complacent. The 1980 franchise review was explicitly forward-looking, building a better, more modern ITV. The head of the IBA was now Lady Plowden, a sort of headmistress figure, and not just because she'd revolutionised primary education in Britain. Now she had to switch to midwifing a new, independent television landscape for the country, including a whole new fourth channel, or two, and one last great step into the unknown. The biggest news of this franchise round, of course, was the invention of breakfast television as a whole new national franchise. That was the hot ticket for 1980, just as Yorkshire had been in 1967. Except this time, there were more than a couple of viable options. The less likely ones included a bid headed by Baroness Trumpington, which is not a name I just made up, but a hard-right Tory organiser whose vision for ITV breakfast would probably have been even more Thatcherite than the real thing. It was called Daytime TV, and the money came from Philips. Babyface satire pioneer Ned Sherrin was in the mix as well. His bid had the unlikely name of Good Morning Television. What kind of title was that? His team also included former BBC political editor Hardman Scott and Julian Pettifer, ready to swap Vietnam for Busman's Holiday. Meanwhile, Morning TV, headed by Mike Townsend, a former editor for Thames's equivalent of World in Action, rather hopefully promised David Dimbleby as a host. Of the bigger, likelier bidders, Daybreak TV attracted interest for the involvement of jet-setting broadcasting demigod Alan Wicker, although no one seemed quite certain in what capacity. England cricket captain Mike Brearley was also said to be a part of it somehow, although again God knows how. The main movers behind Daybreak were the mega-conglomerate Trafalgar House, then owners of the Express Group newspapers, and the Associated Communications Company, Lou Grade's holding corporation that owned ATV. This part was considered a little on the dodgy side, especially since, should Daybreak have won, they would have operated out of the same Elstree studios where ATV were making half their programming for their Midlands franchise. More on that later though. Another paper to be involved was the Financial Times, whose owners Pearson desperately wanted to enter the television business. They were the engine behind a consortium calling itself AMTV. That's AMTV, chaired by Chris Chataway, former Commonwealth long-distance gold medalist, turned ITN's first ever anchorman, turned Tory MP and briefly Postmaster General, turned banker. And then there was AMTV, or AMT as it hurriedly renamed itself after noticing the name was taken. This one was headed by Lord Lever of the soap-making family, although the Lever Company was well out of family hands by then. It also included Jonathan Dimbleby and early Murdoch protégé Bert Hardy. It promised regular slots for newspaper columnists, probably because the likes of The Guardian's Peter Jenkins and the Financial Times' David Watt were among the directors, and a daily good news programme. The early favourites were ITN, who planned to produce a single 3-hour morning show. It's probably safe to assume it would have been by and large a news programme, but whether it would have been hard news along the lines of the BBC's 90s provision, or something softer, is unknown. They did promise something they called computerised news, but that could have meant almost anything really. What we do know is that they were positioning Anna Ford as presenter, until Anna had to tell them that she was already involved in one of the other bids, at which point ITN not only dropped her from their bid, but fired her from the company altogether. That other bid, of course, was TVAM, headed by Peter Jay, fronted by 5 distinguished television figures. Anna Ford, of course, her fellow anchor lady Angela Rippon, Michael Parkinson, recently repatriated from Australia, where he uniquely gained some breakfast TV experience, Robert Key, less of an on-screen legend but a great journalist and historian, and, returning from the wilderness, David Frost, making his second attempt at running an ITV station. TVAM ultimately emerged triumphant, for a couple of reasons. ITN's bid was a good one as far as it went, but it didn't seem likely to punch through in the ratings against what the IBA considered would be inevitable competition from the BBC. Besides, there were issues with ITN effectively running a franchise. At the time, it was joint owned by all the ITV companies as a way of fulfilling their contractual obligation to produce some news. So there were definite issues with it becoming one of those companies in its own right, selling its own advertising. The other reason for TVAM's triumph was, like London winning the 2012 Olympics, the final presentation. Peter Jay and his famous 5 rehearsed the pitch extensively, with the help of Jay's great mate John Burt, and on the day they walked in with such swagger and poise that even the stern headmistress-like Lady Plowden was impressed. On top of that, where most of the other bids had vague ideas and the odd gimmick, even ITN's, TVAM actually had plans, and even a philosophy, like London Weekend before it. A lot like London Weekend before it, in fact. And of course the rest is history repeating itself almost exactly, only much faster, and demonstrating that David Frost wasn't the kind to learn from his mistakes even a little bit. TVAM eventually became one of the most successful and profitable stations in the world, of course, but that wasn't the station that won the bid. It just had the same name and logo. Away from the breakfast table, the franchise round was quite busy. Some places more than others, of course. 7 of the smaller franchisees, Grampian, Border, Channel, retained their contracts in a walkover. Granada essentially did as well. There was a rival called Merseyvision, but that was more of a symbolic thing, a stalking horse from a bunch of Liverpudlians annoyed that Granada didn't seem aware that their region included important settlements outside of Greater Manchester. It never had any chance against the giant, it just wanted to let it know that Liverpool existed. And Granada did build some new studios in Liverpool after inevitably winning the contract back, eventually moving their news there. Yorkshire Television were briefly threatened by the cunningly named Television Yorkshire, headed by Donald Baverstock, the former BBC executive who asked Sidney Newman to invent Doctor Who, and who was later present at the birth of ITV as their first programme director. He had already tried to wrest Tyne Tees from Trident Television, who were ordered broken up as part of this franchise round, with no success. Now he turned to another of the points. He was joined in this venture by Jonathan Aitken, former calendar presenter and later perjuring twat. They thought they could do better than ITV. The IBA thought otherwise. Thames and LWT probably thought themselves safe in the same way as Granada, and essentially they were. But that didn't stop the London franchises from facing some competition, and more serious than Granada's. Serious in the sense that they meant it more anyway. It was certainly hard to take seriously. And not just because it was obviously doomed. It was headed by none other than Hughie Green. Ultra Showbiz, Ultra Schmaltz host and creator of Opportunity Knocks, and also far-right ideologue who'd taken to ending the show with down-the-lens speeches about Britain's decline, usually climaxing with pompous songs about how we won the war and make Britain great again.
Let us all together say in 1975, both to the nation, to each other, and to ourselves, for God's sake, Britain, wake up!
The show was cancelled in 1978 by its producers, Thames, and it's hard not to come to the conclusion that this was his revenge. Although for the record, Thames cancelled it because it was increasingly out of date and not particularly successful in the ratings anymore. Not because of Huey's antics, which they carefully ignored so as not to draw attention to them. Having said that, Huey did actually bid for both franchises at once. LWT was probably just collateral as far as he was concerned. Ultimately, the IBA didn't take much notice, although Huey went to the trouble of creating his own bespoke copy of the TV Times to outline his potential schedule. Sadly, I looked, and I couldn't find a copy of it. In all likelihood, he only made one, and burned it when he inevitably lost. Down in the southwest, home region of this production in case you care, things have been troubled for some time. Westward, formed in 1961, had survived up to this point because no one cared about the southwest region. Besides, they did a good job. The problem was the founding chairman, Peter Cadbury, chocolatier and man with spectacular anger management issues. Apparently he was a nightmare to live next to, work with, or have to interact with in any way. At the drop of a hat, he would start a blazing argument with the hat. More than once his driving exploits ended in all-out fistfights by the side of the road. He wasn't exactly a model Quaker, although thank God he still was one and therefore didn't drink. So you can imagine what it was like to serve on a board of directors under him, or to be part of the regulatory body over him. In 1970, he got into a massive row with the then ITA over a new advertising levy they were introducing, causing the board to sack him, only to rehire him days later, and then almost immediately regret it. After a further decade of constant raging arguments between the board and Cadbury, Cadbury and the IBA, and probably Cadbury and his own thumb, they finally removed him again, this time permanently, in 1980. And although he kept trying to get back in, they managed to keep him out for good. The damage was done, however. Relations with the IBA were completely broken, and there was a decent bid against them from a local consortium underwritten by the Dartington Trust. So Westward lost the franchise to Television Southwest. Little or no protest was made, and Westward, having been losing money for a decade, in part thanks to Cadbury's antics, decided to sell up and leave as soon as possible. So the successor company bought them out for $2.38 million and dutifully carried on broadcasting as Westward until their contract was supposed to start. Initially, of course, they attempted to forge their own identity after that as a glitzy and glamorous television dynamo for the 80s, but this was still Plymouth and they weren't fooling anyone, and before long, it was back to Westward's old format and all the better for it.
Happy New Year! Jolly good.
One of the most attractive regions, of course, was the south. Lots of money to be made out of this region, and the incumbent southern were pretty dull. It had the perfect combination of lucrativeness and vulnerability. Not that southern were worried. They'd been good servants to the region since 1958, and provided all sorts of goodness for the network. Wurzel Gummidge, Out of Town with Jack Hargreaves, Runaround, opera from Glyndebourne. I mean, Winston Churchill, The Wilderness Years, for heaven's sake. They were ITV stalwarts. Still, the attractiveness, bordering on downright sexiness of the franchise meant it was the most bidded for in the network, outside of the all-new breakfast contract. And most of the bids at least mentioned the Southampton-centric nature of Southern television, in the same way that Manchester was dominating Granada. The IBA had actually stepped in this case, making it a dual region with separate news and programming provisions for the western and eastern sides. On top of that, of the three companies that owned Southern, two, Rank and Associated Newspapers, were based in London, and the third, Beano Publishers DC Thomson, were based in Dundee of all places. Pretty much all the bidders made particular note of the fact that they were based in Brighton, or Kent, or Sussex. Network South made some early running. Headed by former LWT boss Tim Margerison and underwritten by Barclays Bank, they caught eyes with their radical restructuring plan. Essentially, they saw the IBA's division of the region in 2 and raised them to 5, all with their own news programmes and everything. Other bids included one from Jerry Anderson, yes, that one, presumably Ed Bishop would have been on continuity, one headed by the BBC's head of plays, James Cahan-Jones, who was Welsh but promised more regional programming than anyone, and one underwritten by the Charterhouse Group and British Rail Pension Fund. Finally, there was South and South East Communications, headed by the young, 43, thrusting freelance ITV producer James Gatwood, alongside some other experienced but relatively young TV faces, including ITN and Thames newsman Bob Southgate, former Tomorrow's World editor Michael Blackstead, and TV journalist and Harold Macmillan lookalike Martin Jackson. They were the hungriest of the bidders, promising to put fun and fire back in the ITV network. Still, Southern weren't worried. Stalwarts, Glyndebourne, Gummidge, all that good stuff. Most importantly, they hadn't done anything particularly wrong to justify their removal, so their own bid ran to a mere 16 complacent pages. So short that some reports claim, although there's no source for it and it might be an urban myth, that the IBA actually asked them to submit again in more depth. If that story is true, then they really shouldn't have been surprised by what happened. But they were.
To revoke the franchise altogether was a total surprise.
Well, we'd better not say much at the moment.
Really?
Really,
Were you
indeed,
surprised?
Yes. Well, as I said, we'd better not say much at the moment. It's, there's lots to talk about. And so forgive us if we don't say anything at the moment.
Were you surprised?
Oh, yes. Too damn right.
Well, in a few minutes, the Managing Director of Southern, Mr. Frank Copplestone, will be releasing a statement to the press. That statement will say that no hasty decisions are being made about their staff or their studios.
And what do you think about Southern losing the contract?
Got any jobs going at your place?
It took several days for Southern's chairman C. David Wilson to compose himself enough to finish a letter to Lady Plowden that veered between pure rage and astonishing passive aggression. The whole letter can be read at the link I'm hopefully putting on screen right now. For the first time, Wilson seethed, a company has been summarily dismissed without previous warning or complaint. Leaving aside the fact that Lord Derby might have had something to say about that, Wilson and Southern in general were completely mischaracterising the process. It wasn't punitive in nature by any stretch. It was simply a clean slate bidding process in which it wasn't enough to prove that you didn't deserve to lose. What you had to demonstrate was that you deserved to win, and Southern didn't. At 16 pages, it seems they barely even tried. They simply didn't put in a good enough bid. The one from James Gatwood's consortium, which would come to be known on screen as Television South, was better, so they won. Quite possible that Southern's 16-page wonder wasn't even the third best bid in this crowded field. What's more, they knew all this, or should have. This was the system they'd signed up to in 1958. The system under which they'd survived 3 franchise rounds already. Lady Plowden even pointed that out to Wilson, according to his own letter. He refused to accept it, but she was right. You can question how fair it is that the companies have to intermittently defend themselves against wholesale replacement at all, instead of having more or less permanent contracts barring accidents, but Wilson didn't do that. Instead, he implied the IBA were making the rules up as they went along, which they weren't. There was nothing he or his company could do about it either way, except marinate in their own rage. So that's what they did for the remaining year. They refused to lift a finger to help their successors. They agreed, probably begrudgingly, to sell them their studios in Southampton at the IBA's request, but refused to let them in until the attosecond the contract was up, which meant TBS's first day was a little bit ramshackle and rushed. They'd only just got in the studios. which was presumably the intention. In the meantime, and with their headquarters in Maidstone still under construction, the new guys had to work out of Elliott huts in Southern's car park. That December, Christmas barely registered for Southern compared to their impending doom. Continuity announcers sat at their desks next to branded tombstones. You half expected them to be wearing black hoods and announcing in Latin. Then on New Year's Eve, viewers in the South were treated to a spectacular display of petulance, starting with the last edition of the local news programme Day by Day, renamed Day by Yesterday. For some reason, some combination of petulance and Armageddon no future nihilism, they broadcast grim highlights from the farewell dinner, including a rambling speech from a clearly drunk Wilson, in which he made it clear he was still angry and bitter and quite intended to remain so. Thank you.
We have suffered, and I mean we have suffered. The agony and shock of that decision on the 28th of December may now be passing. But there remains the rage, the bitterness, the sense of injustice for many on us, and that will not pass.
Concluding with a faintly disturbing toast.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to stand if you would, and I would ask you to join with me in a toast to Southern Television, a fine company, a very fine company.
And that was followed by a song by Richard Stilgo, essentially flicking V signs at the blameless TBS. It was called Portakabin TV.
As you really know, their name, this firm that he's waiting to take over, is Portakabin Television. And we are Portakabin TV, our approach is fresh and new. You won't see us making shows just 'cause they pay. There'll be no more 3 to 1, and crossroads we will shun, well, at least for the first 6 months anyway. We are Portakabin TV, Gatwood, Boston and Blackstad, and on January the 1st our flags unfurled. Our future is assured, we've a lord upon the board, and someone who once did tomorrow's world. We are Portakabin TV, and the southeast of our patch is top of our list of priorities. It will be all systems go in our Maidstone studio just as soon as we find out where Maidstone is.
Again, there should be links on screen right now to view both the speech and the song in full, if you really want to. It is a catchy song. Finally, the night ended with a massive self-pity party called And It's Goodbye From Us, in which Southern basically lauded all its own achievements, with particular focus on the operas and ballets they brought to the masses rather than the likes of Take a Letter, Mr. Jones, or their remake of You Bet Your Life, which they unaccountably gave to Bernard Manning. It all culminated in a massive send-off where the camera panned across all the Southern faces one after the other like condemned prisoners about to face a firing squad, while an orchestra blared a no-holds-barred version of Southern startup music as everything faded to black. Could be forgiven for expecting gunshots. Still, what came next was moving, almost despite itself. Southern weren't even the biggest name to disappear. Of the original Big Four that had started the ITV network in 1955, 2 remained in 1980. By the start of the new contract period in 1982, Granada was alone. ATV still served the Midlands and did it well. The West Midlands anyway. They had a large complex in Birmingham built shortly after surviving the 1967 franchise round, despite all the criticism for being based in Elstree. And that was great, but the likes of Nottingham, Leicester and Derby were still ill-served. And ATV still had those Elstree studios as their effective headquarters. As you may have noticed, the IBA was strongly into local broadcasting by this time. So ATV, despite being one of the biggest names in the network, one of the originals, one of the big 5 consecrated in 1968, were in trouble. Not that their franchise was under all that much threat from without. There were 2 rival bids to ATV, and neither of them were particularly strong. Mercia Television was backed by Nottinghamshire County Council and headed by John Fairley and John Wilford, former producers and executives at Yorkshire. The other bid had YTV connections as well. It was headed by Stuart Wilson, the former chief of the Telefusion rental company that had put together the winning bid back in 1968, only to find himself kicked to the curb after only a couple of years. Neither bid could really threaten the might of ATV. The big eyeball was too big and too valuable to the network to lose the franchise, barring a truly spectacular rival bid, which didn't emerge. But just because they were too big to fail, they weren't untouchable. The IBA still judged that they had not served their region properly by only concentrating on Birmingham, and that after having been nagged into it. So they made the franchise conditional. First, ATV's parent company, Lou Grace Associated Communications, had to sell 60% of shares in its subsidiary ATV Television Limited. Second, the Midlands franchise was, like the South, split in 2, so they would have to serve the East Midlands as well as the West. And finally, the name ATV had to go. It was essentially meaningless, and certainly didn't say anything about its region, which is how Lady Plowden preferred it. Nor did Granada, of course, but over 25 years it had made its name synonymous with the North West. It was Granada land. ATV hadn't managed a similar trick with the Midlands, so the new dual-mandate grade minority company had to adopt a new name to go with its new structure. Oh, and they had to sell Elstree. Ultimately the BBC bought it to make EastEnders there.
The time now, 32 minutes and 53 seconds past midnight. Have a peaceful night, and I hope you enjoy New Year's Day.
Good morning. This is Central, which provides your programmes on the Midlands transmitters of the Independent Broadcasting Authority.
Welcome to 1982. Welcome to Central, a new name in British television, with a fresh approach to the east and west of this dual region.
And so Central was born. Supposedly a continuation of ATV, but as more and more investors joined in, it soon became its own animal. Lou Grade was out of the picture early, as Associated Communications itself was bought out by Australian billionaire, no, not that one either, Robert Holmescourt, who swiftly sold the company's shares in Central, bringing the whole era to a close. And one other notable investor came in 1987, when 20% of shares were bought by Michael Green and his company, Carlton Communications, who had just been told by the IBA that they couldn't buy Thames. And that's how it shook out from 1982, except for TVAM, which needed an extra year. The new contracts were good for just over a decade, and by then, everything would have changed.